thanks for watching this video. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to my channel to stay up to date on all my content. The Supreme Court's ruling in Students for Fair Admissions, Inc. versus President and Fellows of Harvard College ended affirmative action in higher education as we know it. While some Catholics may think this is a political decision, I think it's important to examine what our Catholic faith teaches us about topics like racism and remedies to that racism. So I'm going to discuss the Catholic Church's position on affirmative action in this video today. In the United States Bishop's 1979 pastoral letter, Brothers and Sisters to Us, the bishops clearly supported affirmative action. Under the heading, Racism is a Fact, the bishops wrote, because the courts have eliminated statutory racial discrimination and Congress has enacted civil rights legislation, and because some minority people have achieved some measure of success, many people believe that racism is no longer a problem in American life. The continuing existence of racism becomes apparent, however, when we look beneath the surface of our national life, as for example in the case of unemployment figures. In the second quarter of 1979, 4.9% of white Americans were unemployed, but for blacks the figure was 11.6%. For Hispanics, 8.3%, and for Native Americans on reservations, as high as 40%. The situation is even more disturbing when one realizes that 35% of Black youth, 19.1% of Hispanic youth, and an estimated 60% of Native American youth are unemployed. Quite simply, this means that an alarming proportion of tomorrow's adults are cut off from gainful employment, an essential prerequisite of responsible adulthood. These same youths presently suffer the crippling effects of a segregated educational system, which in many cases fails to enlighten the mind and free the spirit, which too often inculcates a conviction of inferiority, and which frequently graduates persons who are ill-prepared and inadequately trained. In addition, racism raises its ugly head in the violence that frequently surrounds attempts to achieve racial balance in education and housing. With respect to family life, we recognize that decades of denied access to opportunities have been, for minority families, a crushing burden. Racial discrimination has only exacerbated the harmful relationships between poverty and family instability. Racism is only too apparent in housing patterns in our major cities and suburbs. Witness the deterioration of inner cities and the segregation of many suburban areas by means of unjust practices of social steering and blockbusting. Witness also the high proportion of Hispanics, Blacks, and Indians on welfare, and the fact that the median income of non-white families is only 63% of the average white family income. Moreover, the gap between the rich and the poor is widening, not decreasing. Racism is apparent when we note that the population in our prisons consists disproportionately of minorities, that violent crime is the daily companion of a life of poverty and deprivation, and that the victims of such crimes are also disproportionately non-white and poor. Racism is also apparent in the attitudes and behavior of some law enforcement officials and in the unequal availability of legal assistance. Finally, racism is sometimes apparent in the growing sentiment that too much is being given to racial minorities by way of affirmative action programs or allocations to redress long-standing imbalances in minority representation and government-funded programs for the disadvantaged. At times, protestations claiming that all persons should be treated equally reflect the desire to maintain a status quo that favors one race and social group at the expense of the poor and the non-white. Racism obscures the evils of the past and denies the burdens that history has placed upon the shoulders of our Black, Hispanic, Native American, and Asian brothers and sisters. An honest look at the past makes plain the need for restitution wherever possible, makes evidence the justice of restoration and redistribution. Skipping ahead in the letter, the bishops state, we see the value of fostering greater diversity of racial and minority group representation in the hierarchy. Furthermore, we call for the adoption of an effective affirmative action program in every diocese and religious institution. End quote. And even more forcefully, the letter states, we further recommend that Catholic institutions avoid the services of agencies and industries which refuse to take affirmative action to achieve equal opportunity, and that the Church itself always be a model as an equal opportunity employer. Unquote. In 1986, the bishops again addressed affirmative action in Economic Justice for All, Pastoral Letter on Catholic Social Teaching and the U.S. Economy. Under the section Justice and Participation, the bishops wrote, biblical justice is the goal we strive for. This rich biblical understanding portrays a just society as one marked by the fullness of love, compassion, holiness, and peace. On their path, the Christian vision of economic life throughout history, however, sinful human beings need more specific guidance on how to move toward the realization of this great vision of God's kingdom. This guidance is contained in the norms of basic or minimal justice. These norms state the minimum levels of mutual care and respect that all persons owe to each other in an imperfect world. Catholic social teaching, like much philosophical reflection, distinguishes three dimensions of basic justice: commutative justice, distributive justice, and social justice. Commutative justice calls for fundamental fairness in all agreements and exchanges between individuals or private social groups. It demands respect for the equal human dignity of all persons in economic transactions, contracts, or promises. For example, workers owe their employers diligent work in exchange for their wages. Employers are obligated to treat their employees as persons, paying them fair wages in exchange for the work done, and establishing conditions and patterns of work that are truly human. Distributive justice requires that the allocation of income, wealth, and power in society be evaluated in light of its effects on persons whose basic material needs are unmet. The Second Vatican Council stated, quote, the right to have a share of earthly goods sufficient for oneself and one's family belongs to everyone. The fathers and doctors of the Church held this view, teaching that we are obliged to come to the relief of the poor, and to do so not merely out of our superfluous goods. Minimum material resources are an absolute necessity for human life. If persons are to be recognized as members of the human community, then the community has an obligation to help fulfill these basic needs, unless an absolute scarcity of resources makes this strictly impossible. No such scarcity exists in the United States today. Justice also has implications for the way the larger social, economic, and political institutions of society are organized. Social justice implies that persons have an obligation to be active and productive participants in the life of society, and that society has a duty to enable them to participate in this way. This form of justice can also be called contributive, for it stresses the duty of all who are able to help create the goods, services, and other non-material or spiritual values necessary for the welfare of the whole community. In the words of Pius VI, it is of the very essence of social justice to demand from each individual all that is necessary for the common good. Productivity is essential if the community is to have the resources to serve the well-being of all. Productivity, however, cannot be measured solely by its output in goods and services. Patterns of production must also be measured in light of their impact on the fulfillment of basic needs, employment levels, patterns of discrimination, environmental quality, and sense of community. The meaning of social justice also includes a duty to organize economic and social institutions so that people can contribute to society in ways that respect their freedom and the dignity of their labor. Work should enable the working person to become, quote, more a human being, end quote, more capable of acting intelligently, freely, and in ways that lead to self-realization. Economic conditions that leave large numbers of able people unemployed, underemployed, or employed in dehumanizing conditions fail to meet the converging demands of these three forms of basic justice. Work with adequate pay for all who seek it is the primary means for achieving basic justice in our society. Discrimination in job opportunities or income levels on the basis of race, sex, or other arbitrary standards can never be justified. It is a scandal that such discrimination continues in the United States today. Where the effects of past discrimination persist, society has the obligation to take positive steps to overcome the legacy of injustice. Judiciously administered affirmative action programs in education and employment can be important expressions of the drive for solidarity and participation that is at the heart of true justice. Social harms call for social relief. Basic justice also calls for the establishment of a floor of material well-being on which all can stand. This is a duty of the whole of society, and it creates particular obligations for those with greater resources. This duty calls into question extreme inequalities of income and consumption when so many lack basic necessities. Catholic social teaching does not maintain that a flat arithmetical equality of income and wealth is a demand of justice, but it does challenge economic arrangements that leave large numbers of people impoverished. Further, it sees extreme inequality as a threat to the solidarity of the human community, for great disparities lead to deep social divisions and conflict. So that's what the USCCB had said in two of their pastoral letters, and ahead of a 2001 World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace decided to republish the document, The Church and Racism, Towards a More Fraternal Society. Under the heading Positive Discrimination as a Means of Counteracting Racism and Forms of Discrimination, it states, regarding good practices to promote, and more especially what is called positive discrimination or affirmative action, it is well known that the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination of 21 December 1965 envisages in Article 1.4 the possibility of adopting special measures, quote, for the sole purpose of securing adequate advancement of certain racial or ethnic groups or individuals requiring such protection as be necessary in order to ensure groups or individuals equal enjoyment or exercise of human rights, end quote. On this basis of affirmative action, various countries have adopted legislation providing special protection, notably for indigenous peoples and minorities. These voluntary measures are intended to ensure effective recognition of the equality of all. For example, by facilitating access to bank loans for a particular category of the population. There are different systems of applying such measures. The many more or less obligatory provisions for affirmative action. The system of quotas imposing a fixed percentage of one or other group of people in public employment, schools, universities, elections, etc. The choice of this kind of policy remains controversial. There is a real risk that such measures will crystallize differences rather than foster social cohesion. That in the area of employment or political life, for example, there will be recruitment or election of individuals on the basis of their ethnic group rather than their competence. And finally, that freedom of choice will be compromised. Those who support these voluntary policies reply that it is not enough to recognize equality. It has to be created. And in fact, it cannot be denied that the weight of historical, social, and cultural precedents requires at times positive action by states. The Catholic Church is always keen to defend the reality of the concrete person situated in history, and she calls for effective respect for human rights. These policies are legitimate to the extent that they respect the prudent reserve of Article 1.4 of the 1965 Convention, which provides that these measures of positive discrimination must be temporary, that they ought not have the effect of maintaining different rights for different groups, and that they must not be kept in force once their objectives have been achieved. So as we fast forward to today, and Catholic colleges and universities have had their own statements to make an opinion on the affirmative action ruling, I'm going to read two of those statements. The first, the statement of the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities on the Supreme Court's race and admissions ruling, reads as follows. The Supreme Court's 6-3 ruling on the use of race as a factor among the considerations for college admissions is more than disappointing, as it ignores the more than apparent effects of continued racism in our society. In doing so, it undermines the work that higher education has voluntarily taken on for many decades to be a solution in a society that provides too few solutions for this social evil. At this moment of U.S. history, the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities chooses to be guided by its Catholic social teaching and will, within the bounds articulated by this latest decision, continue to create paths by which those in society who do not have opportunity find it at our institutions. The statement by the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities reads as follows. Jesuit colleges and universities were founded to support the educational aspirations of immigrants, the poor, and those from diverse backgrounds. They have contributed toward the building of a more just and equitable civil society since the earliest days of our nation's founding. Given the recent decision of the United States Supreme Court on affirmative action, we will honor our mission, guided by Catholic social teaching and its vision of the common good, to continue our commitment to expanding the recruitment of Pell-eligible, first-generation, and underrepresented students to our institutions. So after the ruling, an ABC News Ipsos poll taken found that a little more than half of Americans, 52%, approve of the U.S. Supreme Court's decision on restricting the use of race as a factor in college admissions, while 32% disapprove and 16% say they don't know. A majority of Republicans, 75%, and independents, 58%, approve of the ruling, while a distinct minority of Democrats, 26%, approve. Most white people, 60%, and Asian people, 58%, approve of the Supreme Court's decision, while only 25% of Black people and 40% of Hispanic people support the decision. 40% of Hispanic people also disapproved of the decision. It will be interesting to see the broader Catholic opinion on the ruling. Personally, I think all people would agree with the bishops and with the Vatican's document that affirmative action was not supposed to be a permanent policy. However, I agree with the justices who dissented and do not believe that the U.S. has progressed to a state where racism is no longer prevalent enough to end affirmative action. When we look at the unemployment rates, we still see African Americans and Latinos with disproportionately higher unemployment rates. And while Asian Americans may have progressed to a certain level above Black people and Latino people and Native American people, there's still three groups of people who are experiencing the effects of racism in the country. In a 2022 Washington Post article by Valerie Strauss titled "Why Race-Based Affirmative Action is Still Needed in College Admission," Strauss states, quote, "Racial inequality in the United States stems partly from the ongoing knock-on effects of past exclusion and discrimination. For example, white families have had more opportunities over generations to accumulate wealth. That wealth often aids middle-class whites as they go to buy their first home. The average white family today holds more than $170,000 in net assets, compared with just $17,000 for the average Black family. In turn, middle-class Black families tend to live in more disadvantaged neighborhoods than middle-class white families. This affects where their children go to school and who they go to school with. But history is not the only driver of racial inequality. Decades of research have shown that unequal opportunities continue to shape the educational experiences of Black, Latino, and Native American youth, even within the same schools, and even with well-meaning teachers. To take one example, when tested for unconscious bias, most teachers show pro-white, anti-Black bias. In turn, when teachers hold implicit racial bias, their Black students have demonstrably worse learning outcomes. Black youth also experience more disciplinary surveillance at school and harsher punishments for the same behaviors compared with their white peers. In contrast, white youth tend to enjoy many privileges in the United States. These privileges including growing up, on average, in more affluent neighborhoods and attending higher performing schools than Black and Latino youth, even of the same social class, and having parents with more financial resources to support their development. Increasingly, Asian Americans too benefit from privileges previously associated with whites. The two largest subgroups of Asian Americans, Indian Americans and Chinese Americans, have incomes and levels of education that on average surpass those of whites, due in part to U.S. immigration policy since the 1960s, which has made it much easier for highly educated Asians to move to the United States compared with low-skilled Asians. Studies show that even middle and upper middle class Black Americans don't reap the benefits associated with financial security that others enjoy. A recent study found that Black adults in the United States born in households with incomes above the 80th percentile, in 2019 that'd be more than $142,000 per year, are as likely to fall to the bottom 20% as they are to remain in the top 20%. In contrast, white adults are 5 times as likely to remain in the top 20% as they are to slip to the bottom 20%. End quote. The Supreme Court's ruling did not entirely end colleges and universities' ability to consider race in admissions. Chief Justice Roberts stated, quote, "At the same time as all parties agree, nothing in this opinion should be construed as prohibiting universities from considering an applicant's discussion of how race affected his or her life, be it through discrimination, inspiration, or otherwise." He goes on to say, "A benefit to a student who overcame racial discrimination, for example, must be tied to that student's courage and determination. or a benefit to a student whose heritage or culture motivated him or her to assume a leadership role or attain a particular goal must be tied to that student's unique ability to contribute to the university. In other words, the student must be treated based on his or her experiences as an individual, not on the basis of race. End quote. It's going to be interesting to see how universities, including Catholic universities and colleges, will interpret that. I'm going to add links to all the documents I referenced in this video so you can view them in their entirety if you'd like. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on the decision, and please make sure to like and subscribe.